Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this one, my friends, I'm gonna be testing a GeForce RTX 3060 12GB GPU in Assassin's Creed Shadows. This one is the AFOX model of the card. I am running it with the latest Nvidia drivers and I'm not manually overclocking it. You can see all of its specs right here in Tech Power-Up's GPU-Z. It's released in 2021, 4 years ago, guys. This is a 4-year-old GPU, let that sink in. It still costs $300, that's 10% lower than what it released at. Anyway, moving on to the left, I am pairing it with the i5-12600KF CPU, overclocked to 5.1 GHz and 32 GB of RAM. Let's get into it, shall we? Moving on to the game settings now, I have it at 1080p resolution at the moment using DLSS and I am using Benchmark King's optimized settings. Ray tracing is enabled with diffuse everywhere right here and medium on the ray tracing quality. Everything else is set to Benchmark King's optimized. And guys, we're starting in this area which is really intensive and the 3060 is already dropping from 30 FPS at 1080p resolution. So remember when I said this is a 4-year-old GPU? Yeah, I mean, since it is 4 years old after all, and this game doesn't really do that well with Nvidia GPUs, and it's actually not the greatest thing in terms of optimization, especially with that ray tracing enabled. I mean, yeah, this is kind of what you'd expect, right? But considering this is still a $300 GPU, it's really crappy performance. These GPUs, I mean, 3060 level of performance should be around $150 these days. Yes, it does have 12 GB of VRAM, which is nice, and it's way better than what you get on like the RTX 4060, which is an 8 GB GPU, and probably the upcoming 5060, which will likely be an 8 GB GPU as well. What are you doing, Nvidia? So yeah, it does have some advantages compared to other GPUs in its price range, but if you compare it to like a 4060, the 4060 was doing quite a bit better here in this title, you know? But anyway, it's a shame. Like, the GPU market these days is way too expensive, way too overpriced, and I don't understand how a 4-year-old GPU can still cost $300 brand new. It's really crazy to me. Like, I was talking to a friend of mine. He was interested in buying a 3060 or a 3060 Ti. 3060 Ti can't really be found brand new anymore here, but the 3060 can be, and it was like $300 before the 50 series were out, actually, like 5090, 5080, 5070s. And I was telling him, yeah, just wait for those GPUs to drop, the next generation, and usually you'd see a drop in prices, at least on the 30 series, which is 2 generations old already. But we didn't really see that. We saw a 10% discount. Yeah. Anyway, we still have frame generation to save the day, sort of, but the thing about frame generation is, if you enable it on top of 30 FPS baseline, yes, you're gonna achieve 60s most of the time, as you can see, 60 something. It looks a lot smoother to you guys, obviously, because it's not choppy 30 FPS anymore, but the input lag is so big that I don't like it. I cannot play like this, especially when it starts dropping into the 50s. I think even with a controller, this would be a pretty terrible experience with 50-something FPS. Maybe at 60 plus all of the time, it would be decent and doable, but in terms of input lag here, I just hate it. Even with the controller, I would hate it with 50-something FPS, and you do get 50-something FPS in a lot of areas in the map. So, yeah, this is not a viable option, unfortunately, guys. I think we definitely need to remove ray tracing from the settings, you know, because the 3060 just can't really do it. But another thing that you could try before we disable that ray tracing and make it like medium settings without RT is quality DLSS. And quality DLSS in this game, again, I didn't really override it to use DLSS 4, so it looks a little bit softer than DLSS 4, but it's also a little bit less intensive, and we kind of need all of the FPS that we can get with this GPU. So yeah, 40-ish something FPS is not too bad, and in terms of graphics, I am using a 27-inch 1080p monitor right now, and it actually does look very acceptable, unless you start looking at like the hair from the horse and stuff. That looks pretty pixelated, yeah, and kind of artifacty as well. You see a lot of noise in some areas, especially moving areas like around the horse and around the character as well. But it's not the end of the world. If you have a smaller monitor, especially like a 24-inch 1080p, which is very common, this will look just fine. It is upscaling from 720p resolution to 1080p, and that's not a lot of pixels to start with, but it's DLSS. It actually does look really good, and it looks way better than, for example, the FSR implementation in this title. This feels a lot smoother. This is actually playable if you need that ray tracing, which does make quite a bit of a difference here in this title, by the way. Everything is way blender without ray tracing enabled in this one. Yeah, you can utilize it here as long as you use some DLSS at the same time. And once again, that's to be expected. The 3060 is from 30 series RTX GPUs. That's the second generation RTX cards that came out, of course, the first one being the 20 series. And with these cards, at least on the 3060 Ti, you needed to utilize some DLSS even when they came out, when games were kind of optimized, you know. Yeah, you still needed to utilize DLSS if you wanted to use ray tracing at the same time. The big thing about this game, and the big issue that I have with it, is that when you disable ray tracing, you don't gain that much FPS, okay? Sometimes in other games you'd see a 50% improvement, 40% improvement. Over here it's like a 15% improvement. It's pretty minor. There's not a lot of scaling there, and in resolutions as well. It's kind of crazy. We've seen the 5070 Ti, for example, going from 30 FPS at 4K to 50 FPS or 55 FPS at 720p. And since we got 45 plus FPS all of the time, I think enabling FSR FG might actually help the experience quite a bit, because in other titles I usually say you need a baseline of 60 FPS to make it enjoyable with frame generation enabled, to have not a lot of input lag, you know, that you can notice. And over here in this title, that happens on the 40 FPS mark. So if you have 40 plus FPS all of the time, I think it's a pretty good experience when you enable the frame generation on top of that, you know. So maybe if you play with a controller, I would do this. But since it still drops into the 60s around here, I could still feel a lot of input lag there when that happened. Yeah, over here as well, 68 frames per second, lower 70s. It is acceptable, and a lot of people will be completely fine with this experience, alright, input lag-wise, and smoothness-wise as well, of course. But in my opinion, at least to me, I wouldn't really enable the frame generation, because it gets really input laggy, unless I was playing with a controller, once again. But on mouse and keyboard, I think I would prefer 40 to 50 FPS experience that we were seeing before, than this with really high input lag, but 60 plus 100% of the time. 1% lows are actually at 60 FPS right now. So, not amazing, but it's definitely a lot more passable than the native resolution stuff was with frame generation. I know a lot of people that are actually playing this game with frame generation at around 70, 80 frames per second, so what we're seeing right now, and they're completely fine with it. And half of them don't even know that they have frame generation enabled, because I keep seeing those comments saying, my 4070 is doing 80 FPS when your 5070 Ti is doing 50. I mean, that's because you have frame generation enabled, you don't even know about it. It's still a very playable experience. Also, I'm not sure if you've been noticing, the power utilization of this card is not really hitting the 170 watt mark, at least right now. That's the TDP of this GPU, by the way. But that's just because this game on Nvidia GPUs, it's not the most optimized thing, really. I'm still waiting for a driver to come out and actually make the game better on Nvidia cards, because at least with the 50 series especially, those are like 100 watts or 50 to 100 watts away from TDP, which is a big difference. And I think if they were actually running at TDP, they would be a little bit faster. Now, I just loaded the first game again, guys. We're getting 31 FPS here. Look in this direction. Alright, just for a little bit of a comparison, I'm gonna disable the ray tracing now. So instead of having ray traced global illumination set to diffuse everywhere, I'm gonna set it to diffuse hideout only. You can clearly see right away in this picture what I was telling you about. Ray tracing actually transforms the look of the game quite a lot. Look at that. That's huge. It looks so flat without it that I really don't like it. But let's try it like this, okay? There's no need to change the ray tracing settings, by the way, because this is now only working in the hideout area, which is not where we are. And we went from 31 FPS to 36. See? That 15 to 20% improvement that I was telling you about with the ray tracing being enabled or disabled. In other titles, you'd see a way bigger difference. Here, you see a 15 to 20% difference, which is not going to be super game-changing, unfortunately. So we need to drop down some more settings to make it decent. I guess this is now 30 plus FPS all of the time, but it, again... not amazing, is it? And also, it looks so flat in these darker scenes with shadows and stuff. It starts looking like a way older title, in my opinion, than it actually is, whereas with ray tracing, it looks pretty impressive. So yeah, I'm just gonna set it to the medium settings preset on the overall preset right here, and this is it, okay? Lots of things are now on medium, some of them are on low. Let's apply that. I will reload the game because you need to apply the settings fully, of course. And now, instead of getting like 36 frames per second, we're getting 46. So we gained another 10 frames per second on top of disabling ray tracing, which will make a lot of a difference now, because this is now 1080p native resolution, not 1080p with quality DLSS, and we're getting the same FPS as 1080p with quality DLSS before. So if you prefer that native resolution with DLAA enabled, go for this. But if you prefer the next gen kind of look in this game, go for ray tracing with quality DLSS, because it's still going to look better in my opinion, just a little bit more fuzzy and a little bit more noisy and softer as well. But hey, a lot of people will prefer that native resolution look. That's totally fine. Different people will have different opinions, my friends, and they're all right. Okay, getting 50s around here. You can see the grass just popping in as you walk. Not super noticeable, and definitely not as noticeable as low settings were, but there's a little bit less vegetation density here on medium settings and more popping as well on the overall picture. It doesn't look terrible, but it does at the same time compared to the optimized settings with the ray tracing enabled, especially in these flatter areas with the shadows. That's why I sticked to high settings, I believe, on the 3060 Ti, and I preferred high settings on that GPU. Here, well, you're gonna be stuck to medium because high is just not gonna happen with the 3060, unfortunately. Although optimized settings are close to high settings in terms of visuals, and they still have that ray tracing and stuff. But again, you already know it. We already tested those. Let's keep on going here. Actually, let's stop it right there because this is a good baseline FPS to enable frame generation in this title, as long as it doesn't drop from 70 frames per second with that FG enabled, because then, again, you start noticing a ton of input lag. But here we go. This is frame generation on top of native 1080p with medium settings. Not too bad of an experience. And you know what? On medium settings here, we might actually be able to play even at 1440p resolution, which is going to be quite interesting, because this is a 12 gigabyte GPU, but it doesn't really have that raw power for 1440p gaming anymore, at least in these newer titles. Lots of older titles will work fine at 1440p with this card, though. It is not terrible. It's dropped sometimes into the 60s. Again, you can get used to it as well, especially if you don't care much about input lag and you don't notice it too often. it's totally fine of an experience. Definitely a little bit more stable than it was previously with the optimized settings and the frame generation on top of native res, on top of quality DLSS, because on top of native res it was terrible. But yeah, it can still drop sometimes into the 60s, and then input lag will actually be quite high. But now let's turn off frame generation, use quality DLSS, and here we might see... Yeah, it's not that much better, is it? Oh man, see what I mean, guys? Whenever you start lowering resolution, it just doesn't change by all that much. 40s. This is 720p being upscaled to 1080p. Oh man. You know what, let me just do a little experiment here. So we're getting 53 FPS standing still here. And with performance, let's do performance DLSS, which is going to render the game at 540p resolution and upscale it to 1080p, of course. And we gained 5 FPS, yeah. I mean, 540p seriously doesn't even reach 60 FPS. And what about native AA? So back to DLAA here. 47 FPS. So we gain 11 frames per second, or 12, by going from native 1080p, which is crispy with DLAA, to 10 FPS right now, actually, 48 to 58, to a 540p experience with performance DLSS, which is 10 FPS more, which is 20% higher, by the way. It's not 20% lower resolution for it to only be a 20% difference, but that makes it so quality DLSS isn't going to be that big of a difference. Again, we went from 48 FPS to 53 FPS. And when you start walking around and riding Roach around town and stuff, it drops a couple of more frames, so there's that. I mean, it still looks good, of course. Once again, DLSS works really well in this game, although I can tell the difference, obviously. But it's not that big difference that we're used to. Usually we see a 33% improvement in FPS when enabling DLSS on quality compared to native. Here, that doesn't really happen. But at least it's a smooth experience in terms of stuttering. There is no major stuttering issues. And also you can make it pretty playable with that frame generation while looking good and feeling responsive, especially with these baseline FPS that we're getting right now. 50 to 60, you know, pretty decent. Inside of town, it still dropped into the 40s, but I think now when enabling the frame generation on top of this, let's do that. Where is it? Frame gen, FSR, FG, let's go, save it. And yeah, this is going to be a lot better. Look at that, 100 FPS. So for higher refresh rate monitors, you can now take advantage of them. Getting like 100 FPS feels a lot smoother than 80 did. Not really needed in a game like this at the same time, but yeah, it's nice to have that very, very smooth experience. And in terms of input lag, it's really, really good right now with 100 frames per second. So I think that's time for us to check it out at 1440p. And here we have it, 2560 by 1440 resolution. Let's do native res first without FSR FG. And still on the medium settings with no ray tracing or diffuse hideout only. Okay, 28, 27, doesn't even reach 30 FPS now, guys. Even standing still, maybe looking in that direction, okay, now it does, but oh my goodness. This is pretty crazy. So, native 1440p medium settings, you can't do it. Oh, it's them driver problems, isn't it, guys? Like, sometimes with these new drivers, the 30 series do this. Even the 3060 Ti also did this, but I didn't know it was the driver issues. But now I read about it. It's some driver issues. Look at that. Look at that. That's so weird. What are Nvidia doing with the drivers and stuff? This is so weird. Anyway, we need to drop it down to quality DLSS right now. No frame generation at the moment. Let's see if that's enough. What the hell? Everything was red there. Okay, so we did gain a lot of FPS now at 1440p resolution by enabling that DLSS. This is a way bigger difference than it was at the 1080p resolution. All right, now it is actually playable at 38 FPS average at the moment, not too terrible. Going into the bamboo forest right here, 37, 39, 40. Is usually pretty intensive, especially with the ray tracing enabled, not so much without it. But yeah, this is now a playable 1440p experience, so if you want to play this at this resolution, it will work on medium settings. Oh, wait a second. Yeah, where is Miguel? We haven't seen Miguel yet in this video, or Jack. But wait, no, that's not Jack or Miguel. But anyway, over here, much better, much more consistent since we're far away from a city area, you know, getting 45 frames per second. Inside of forests, sometimes you see it drop further than what you see in the city, by the way. But come on. Not by too much. All right, and there is a particular forest in this title that will make your FPS cry, or your GPU cry a lot. That's where the 5070 Ti couldn't even reach 60 FPS at 720p resolution, maximum settings, but still, very, very bad. Let's enable the frame generation right now. And oi to you too, how's it going? And we're getting 70s right away. These are the best FPS that we'll see with the frame generation, I think, because we're going into the city again. 80s, not too bad. This is totally acceptable, but as soon as we enter the city, it starts dropping into those 60s, and then input lag starts becoming a little bit of an issue to me. So again, it's the same thing. If you have a controller, if I had a controller right here, I would play with the frame generation enabled. You know, you can also get used to it after playing for like 15 minutes with, or even 5 to 10 minutes, honestly, with the frame generation enabled. You can play it absolutely fine. It will feel okay. With these FPS, that is. But for me, it's just a little bit too much input lag with these FPS, especially now that it's starting to drop into the low 60s. That's a lot of input lag. So yeah, with a controller, I wouldn't mind this. Without a controller, I very much do mind it. Okay, well, let's go to that little area where it dropped to 60 FPS and change the DLSS super resolution presets. So we're getting 68, 69 FPS, nice. And just by moving down a notch over here on the upscaling quality, we moved from 68 to 73. That's a little bit of a bigger difference than I thought it would be. Not too bad. Although, it's quite a bit softer, interestingly. I think balanced DLSS is 58% resolution scale and quality DLSS is 67% resolution scale. And I guess if this was DLSS 4, it would also be a little bit slower, so yeah. But yeah, since it's DLSS 3, you can notice quite a bit more softer look, in my opinion. Still not terrible. But I'm not sure if I would do this, especially since it still drops into the 60s sometimes. Not as far as before, but yeah, not amazing either. And well, guys, it's time for 4K resolution. I don't think a lot of people play at this res anymore with the RTX 3060, still on medium settings, RT off. Obviously, it's going to suck. I mean, at 1440p, we were already seeing less than 30 FPS very often. And, well, 4K resolution is just a bit more intensive. Although, it's not as intensive as other titles, once again, because there is less of a difference between resolutions here. Let's stop it there. This is quite the cinematic look. Around 24 FPS, you know, and I really don't like it. Let's do performance DLSS right away, because it's 4K resolution. Performance DLSS looks pretty acceptable in my opinion. And here we get around 40-ish frames per second. It's going to drop inevitably into the 30s, which is not terrible, once again, but it is terrible for the frame generation, of course. So if you were to enable FG on top of this, it would be pretty crappy, especially because it's 4K resolution, so it won't generate as many frames either. It's gonna be a pretty sucky experience, in my opinion. So if you want 4K resolution, stick to these settings. Medium with performance DLSS, I think, is the way to go. It performs acceptably, I guess. And it looks pretty sharp still. The DLSS at 4K is really, really nice. And a lot of people say, even the 5090 or 5080, those aren't 4K gaming GPUs because they can't do 4K native res with ray tracing at 60 FPS and so on. Well, no. I highly disagree, because as soon as you start using DLSS, even on performance DLSS, you can still have a greater image quality than 1440p native resolution, with usually higher FPS than 1440p native resolution as well, especially on those higher end GPUs. So yeah, why not have 4K monitors? I've been using a 4K monitor since 2022, I believe, when Nvidia sent me 2021, they sent me the 3060 Ti, which you'd say, it's a 1440p GPU back in 2021, but I played at 4K with that GPU a lot with performance DLSS. Different times though, games were actually optimized, most of them. Now let's try it with FSR frame generation. Last thing to do here on performance DLSS 4K. And we get 60s. So even though the baseline FPS were 40-45 here in this area, enabling FG at 4K will only bump it up to 60 FPS. And of course, inside of town areas, I'm actually going to reload the save game. Yeah, inside of town areas, things start dropping a little into the 50s, and it's not great anymore. Again, even with the controller, it might be pretty bad. So on a TV, I think I would just cap it to like 35 frames per second, since that was the lowest we saw. Get used to that stability with the frame time graph being flat there at 35. And maybe add a little bit of motion blur to disguise the fact that we are running a lower frame rate. And then play with a controller. On a TV, performance DLSS. This is a good experience. I like this. Okay? So yeah, for those of you thinking, 3060... there's no 4K GPU. It sucks at 4K resolution. Not entirely true. It is true for DLSS quality or DLAA or native resolution. But if you start using performance DLSS, even in an unoptimized title like Assassin's Creed Shadows, or a pretty demanding one, it will work on medium settings. So there's that, guys. I'm going to bump it up to quality, actually, to see how it does. Probably going to be a pretty crappy experience. Yep, there we go. The 20s again. And that's been it for this one. Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. And I'll catch you in the next one very soon. As always, love you all. Bye-bye.